So I'm making this video because I want to speak to something which has been reverberating through the political and social world recently, which is the victory of the far-right political party, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, in this eastern state of Germany very recently. And we know that the rise of far-right populist parties has been a trend that we've seen more and more of over the last years across multiple nations, from Brazil and Argentina through to the rise of Trump in the USA, through to the far-right party in France that just recently got closer to power than ever before, and now this election victory of the AfD in this eastern state of Germany. So I'm aware that large numbers of people who are passionate about the multicultural journey of humanity are feeling really afraid by this, and there's a huge rise in polarization that's happening where there's deep confusion and also often deep judgment of the people who would do such a thing as vote for a party like the AfD. And I feel like, I want to make this video because Singularity is dedicated to bursting the bubble of the polarization that is so rife and increasingly explosive within our current politics, and connecting to an aligned and deep stand for what is truly life-giving that is behind all of that polarization, so that we can find our way forward. And that often requires us to be willing to have really vulnerable conversations and to look into areas that were previously feeling, many of us, very reluctant to go, because sometimes there's huge shadows that are playing out collectively that are maintaining the polarization that fuels so much of the destabilization in our societies today. So speaking directly to that, there's a conversation which I want to go into around the rise of these far-right populist parties in places like this state in the east of Germany, which I feel isn't happening, and I feel it's a critical conversation that needs to be had. And that conversation begins with acknowledging that whether we're talking about the rise of the AfD, whether we're talking about the rise of Trump, for instance, whether we're talking about Brexit in Great Britain, where I come from, often the communities of people whose vote has played a huge role in those types of political events happening are white working class people. And what I want to explore in this video is the idea that this is actually a demographic within society that is experiencing a level of cultural fragmentation that we need to talk about, and that we are not talking about, and that we're afraid to talk about. So, the moment that we start talking very often about white culture, or anyone might begin to try and invite a conversation about the health and coherence of white culture, what immediately comes up for many of us is probably fear and contraction, and a sense of immediately the associations of the systemic injustices and traumas that white culture has been responsible for over the course of history and still presently today. And there's then an immediate sense of guilt, deep guilt, that comes up that is related to those injustices, and is an appropriate feeling when we recognize the profound traumas and pain that white culture, not alone, but in major part, has contributed and been responsible for to humanity and to the earth. But what our getting caught in those associations and those feelings often does is it stops us from being able to have a conversation about white culture that would allow us to try and repair and tune into how can there be a deeppening sense of coherence and healthy collective self-identity, and a healthy sense of history, and lineage to white culture that does not have it then veer off into the places that are our immediate associations for anyone trying to have that conversation today, which is for it to veer, immediately when we have conversations like this, we get the sense of, oh, this is so, we're either there already or we're a hair's breadth away from racism or pathological nationalism. It's much easier and more commonplace for there to be conversations that happen within collective culture around the health and coherence of Black culture, for instance, as long as those conversations are particularly initiated by people within Black culture. But those are not uncommon conversations and processes of collective reflection for us to come across. Simultaneously, I live in Germany, and I remember when in 2015 there was this massive influx of Syrian refugees that came, it was not uncommon for there to be conversations that were happening within the political, social domain of Germany around, okay, what can be done? What can be done to help these people stay connected to a coherent and healthy sense of their identity, their traditions, their values, as they come terrified and in traumatized conditions to a place that many of them have never been before? How can that be helped? My point is that it's much more commonplace for us to feel comfortable to have conversations about the coherence and healthy sense of collective self-identity for groups of people of other groups of people than particularly white, and even more so particularly working class people. I was having a conversation with someone the other day who used to work in British government, and they were telling me that when they were part of the government there was a study that they were involved in where there was an attempt to just try and understand why, within the context of the ever-developing multicultural journey of British society, which involves so many people coming from so many places, often with very different levels of financial means, many of them with very, very low financial means, still, even within that diversity of large groups of people who often have very little, still, white, working class, young people had the worst prospects again and again and again, and them just trying to understand why that's the case. I live in Berlin, but I come from the UK, and I remember some years ago when Brexit happened, I was one of the people who was really shocked when I woke up that morning and I turned on the news and I saw that the majority of people had chosen to leave the EU. And it set me off on a journey of really trying to understand what on earth had happened here. And absolutely, of course, there was a bunch of people who contributed to that decision for rational reasons, who didn't feel aligned with the bureaucracy of the EU and various other reasons. And my sense is that a group of people who made a huge contribution to that decision being made was particularly white, working class people in the UK who felt fundamentally left behind by the neoliberal economic paradigm, who came from or connected to generations of underprivilege in terms of lower levels of economic privilege, lower levels of educational privilege, lower levels of employment privilege, and who used that election as an opportunity to say no, who used that election as an opportunity to say this collective cultural societal structure is not working for us, and we're saying that something has to stop. We must make our voices heard. And I think that same impulse is deeply related to the rise of Trump in the USA, and I think it's also deeply related to the rise of the AfD in Germany and populists, and also in France and in other nations as well. And something that the political left and center left often doesn't acknowledge is that no matter how much more inclusively rational they believe their perspectives to be, and how abhorrent they perceive the more yeah, the perspectives of people who are choosing far-right parties are often what goes with people's choice of far-right political parties is a deep sense of betrayal and rage towards the current political structures. And the current political structures have been in, and the um, the multicultural journey, the neoliberal economic multicultural journey of increasingly globalized humanity. And yes, it is. I absolutely have the ideal that we collectively can grow into greater and greater spheres of unity and in celebrated diversity, that we can collectively know ourselves as one in a way that is absolutely not dependent upon skin color or religious orientation or national background or any other demographic that seems to make us different. And at the same time, we can celebrate the diversity of our different cultures and ethnic backgrounds and nations and so on. But what that requires for that to actually be healthy is it requires every sphere of my identity moving out from who I am as an individual into the wider and wider collective spheres that I'm a part of, whether that's my family or my community or the city that I live or my nationality or my ethnic background or whatever those wider and wider spheres are. It requires that those spheres are healthy. Any human being's capacity to comfortably welcome contact with other humans that are really different is very much dependent upon their own sense of security and comfortability in their own identity, who they are, and where they come from. And I feel like that's very much the case with collectives. It's exactly the case with collectives as well. In order for the multicultural journey that is increasingly happening, in particularly in our Western democratic societies, to happen healthily, it requires us to be attentive to the healthy sense of collective identity, culture, values, history, and lineage of all the different cultural groupings involved. And as I say, that's a conversation we've been much more comfortable to have about other communities apart from white culture, and particularly white working class culture. And because of that, because that is a grouping of people who, in my view, are feeling fundamentally left behind and without anything really coherent and healthy to feel like is part of their sense of collective identity, there's something that's being missed. There's something that's falling apart. There's something that's fragmenting. And it's continually fragmenting because this is a conversation that we are afraid to have. Because our associations are that it immediately takes us that there's too much guilt for us to start talking about what would actually contribute to healthy white culture, and also because of our fear that it's a conversation that is immediately going to veer off into pathological nationalism or just downright racism, and into that gap flow in far-right political parties. So yeah, as I say, I feel like this is a conversation that needs to be had. It's a conversation we're generally afraid to have, and yet it's a conversation that, if you think about it, it's just an obvious conversation that must be had. If we're really serious about greater unity and diversity, then that requires us to be attentive to the health, coherence, and healthy sense of self-identity of all the different communities of people who are participating in that wider and wider sphere of diversity.